There's a photograph from the set of Young Frankenstein that still stops people mid-scroll almost 50 years later. In it, Gene Wilder is doubled over, eyes wet, mouth wide open in a laugh. He clearly couldn't stop. It looks staged. It looks like the kind of publicity shot a studio would set up to sell a comedy. But it isn't. Nobody arranged that expression. Nobody asked him to perform it twice. That single frame is one of the rare behind-the-scenes photos with a raw, unfiltered joy of making a movie leak straight through the camera lens. And once you understand what was actually happening around him when it was taken, the picture only gets funnier. To understand why that photograph exists at all, you have to understand the kind of set Mel Brooks built. Released in 1974, Young Frankenstein followed Dr. Frederick Frankenstein, grandson of the infamous scientist, as he reluctantly returns to his family's castle and ends up repeating his grandfather's most famous experiment. Brooks and Gene Wilder wrote the screenplay together, and both men were obsessed with one specific goal. They didn't want to make a parody that mocked old horror movies from a distance. They wanted to make a film that felt like it belonged inside that world. So Brooks insisted on shooting entirely in black and white at a time when almost no major studio would greenlight that choice. He tracked down laboratory equipment that had actually been used in the original 1931 Frankenstein production, some of it built decades earlier by special effects designer Kenneth Strickfaden, and had it installed directly into the new sets. The result looked eerily authentic. What it didn't look like behind the camera was controlled, because underneath all that careful visual homage was a cast that treated the script as a starting point rather than a finish line. Wilder, Marty Feldman, Terry Garr, Peter Boyle, and Madeline Kahn were all gifted improvisers, and Brooks, instead of clamping down on that instinct, let it run. That decision is the real reason the film still feels alive instead of dated. Scenes that were written as ordinary transitions turned into some of the most quoted moments in comedy history, simply because someone on set couldn't resist testing a new line. The clearest early example is the bag scene at the train station. As written, it's a small, functional moment. Frederick arrives with Inga, Igor greets them, and everyone heads off to collect the luggage. Marty Feldman had other plans. During filming, he looked at Wilder and, doing an impression pull from an old Groucho Marx bit, delivered an unscripted line about which of the two bags he'd rather carry, tossing a wink that had nothing to do with luggage at all. It caught everyone off guard. Terry Garr nearly broke on the spot, and Wilder, who was supposed to stay composed as a straight man, visibly fought to keep his face still. Brooks called for another take, and Feldman did the joke again, with a slightly different delivery. Then again, each version had its own timing, its own little twist, and each one sent the crew back into stifled laughter. Eventually, Brooks stopped trying to get a clean version and simply kept the material, because it captured something a rehearsed line never could: real people genuinely amusing each other in the moment. That instinct to preserve accidents rather than erase them became the defining philosophy of production, and nowhere is that clearer than in the story of Igor's hump. According to accounts from people involved in the film, Feldman began quietly shifting the prosthetic hump from one shoulder to the other between takes. Purely as a private joke, he was playing on the crew. He kept doing it for days before anyone caught on. When people finally noticed, the hump kept jumping, sides from shot to shot, instead of ordering reshoots to fix the continuity error. Brooks found it hilarious and folded it directly into the film. That's the origin of one of the most famous exchanges in the movie, when Frederick gestures at Igor's back and asks whether the hump used to be on the other side, and Igor, without a flicker of concern, simply denies having a hump at all. It's a joke built entirely out of a mistake nobody bothered to correct, and it works precisely because Igor never explains it, never reacts to it, and just treats it as completely normal. In a film built around the idea that anything can happen inside the strange, gothic world, a hump that quietly relocates itself fits right in. Another piece of on-set improvisation that almost didn't survive the editing process is the famous walk this way gag, where Igor picks up Frederick at a foggy train station and tells him to walk a certain way, then hobbles off using a small cane, forcing the much taller Wilder to imitate his awkward gait. According to people involved in the production, the joke traces back to an old vaudeville routine about a customer asking a pharmacist for talcum powder, and there's some disagreement over who actually brought it to the set, with Wilder crediting Brooks and Feldman claiming he ad-libbed it himself. What isn't disputed is that both actors initially tried to talk Brooks out of using it. worried it was too old and too corny for the film. Brooks disagreed and kept pushing for it. Later, during an early test screening, he reportedly grew nervous the movie was dragging and considered cutting the gag entirely, only for the audience's reaction in that screening to convince him belonged. It's a good reminder that not every memorable moment in this film came from a single burst of spontaneous chaos. Some of them survived because Brooks was stubborn enough to trust his own instincts even when his closest collaborators disagreed with him. Not every unscripted moment came from the main cast, either. One frequently mentioned incident from the shoot involves Gene Hackman, who appears in a small, uncredited role as a blind hermit the monster stumbles upon. In the scene, the hermit fumbles around trying to serve his unexpected guest food and drink, and accounts from production describe Hackman capping the sequence with an ad-libby line about wishing he'd made espresso instead, delivered so dryly that it reportedly caught the crew off guard and forced the scene to end abruptly because people on set couldn't stop laughing. It's a small moment in the finished film, but it's another example of the same pattern repeating itself. Give a talented performer room to play, and something unplanned and funnier than the page tends to show up. Once that spirit of keep it if it's funny took hold, it spread to the rest of the cast. Terry Garr leaned further into physical comedy. Peter Boyle experimented more freely with the monster's groans and lumbering movements. Madeline Kahn brought in theatrical flourishes that weren't in the original pages, and accidents kept multiplying. Continuity became a running joke in itself. A candle would be lit in one shot and unlit in the next. A coffee cup would vanish or switch hands between angles. Small details of stricter production would have painstakingly matched. Brooks let almost all of it stand because he believed those tiny imperfections made the world of film feel lived in rather than staged. The dinner and laboratory sequences brought their own share of near misses. One frequently retold anecdote involves Feldman biting into a piece of fur trim on Madeline Kahn's costume during a scene, only to end up with strands of it caught in his mouth, which sent his reactions further off script and left Kahn struggling to hold her own composure across several takes. Wig troubles cropped up more than once as well, under the heat of the studio lights. Peter Boyle's monster wig reportedly began sliding out of place mid-shot during the operating table sequence, and rather than stop and reset, the cast simply played through it, treating the slip as though it belonged in the scene. Terry Garr had a similar experience with her own wig during a separate take, and instead of reshooting to hide it, the moment was left in, adding an unplanned, slightly disheveled realism to her performance as Inga. None of these were written into any draft of the script. They were the product of hot lights, aging costume pieces, and a crew that had learned, scene after scene, that a mishap handled well on camera was often funnier than a mishap avoided entirely. Some of the chaos came from the physical set itself rather than the actors. A heavy wooden door that Wilder had to close kept sticking, take after take, and rather than fight through his frustration off camera, he folded it into performance, exaggerating his reaction until the jammed door became its own small comic beat. The laboratory equipment, being decades old, occasionally misbehaved during shooting, and the actors learned to treat any spark, clatter, or malfunction as fuel rather than a problem, staying in character and reacting as though it belonged in the scene. Even the sound design got it on it. Every time a character said the name of the housekeeper, Frau Blucher, the crew would trigger an off-screen horse whinny, a gag that reportedly grew out of a linguistic mix-up involving the German word for glue. What started as a single scripted cue became a running joke the cast had to react to in real time throughout the shoot, since nobody knew exactly when it would fire. Then there's the moment tied to the elevator sequence, which is where that now famous photograph comes from. The elevator prop used in the laboratory scenes wasn't built for a perfectly smooth ride, and during filming it reportedly wobbled and jolted more than anyone intended. Terry Garr's screaming character as Inga carried real alarm in it, because the equipment genuinely felt unstable in that moment. Rather than call the take and reset everything, Wilder and Feldman stayed locked into their roles, letting real tension bleed into their performances. It's during this stretch of chaotic, half-controlled filming that the picture of Wilder in uncontrollable, unposed laughter was captured. No retake, no direction from Brooks to give us something big for the camera. Just a moment where the absurdity of the situation, the equipment, the noise, whatever joke had just landed off camera, hit him at exactly the wrong second for him to stay composed, and a photographer happened to catch it. That's the whole secret behind the picture. It looks unbelievable because it's completely unstaged, and once you know how loose and improvisational this particular set was, an outburst like that stops being surprising and starts feeling inevitable. It also helps to remember just how much creative freedom Brooks was giving up by allowing all of this. He was directing a film that leaned heavily on visual precision, matching the look, lighting, and rhythm of decades-old horror classics, almost shot for shot in places. That kind of homage usually demands tight control. Yet in the same production, he was comfortable letting actors rewrite dialogue mid-scene, letting props misbehave on camera, and letting a joke about a moving hump reshape a piece of the script after the fact. Those two impulses, meticulous craftsmanship on one hand and total openness to accident on the other, shouldn't really work. Together, on this particular set, they did, largely because Brooks had a clear enough sense of the film's tone to recognize instantly which surprises fit that world and which ones didn't. It's worth pointing out that Brooks didn't treat this looseness as a lucky accident he tolerated once. It was closer to a working method. He trusted his cast enough to let a joke evolve across multiple takes instead of locking it after the first attempt. And he was willing to let continuity slip if the trade-off was a moment that felt genuinely funny rather than mechanically correct. Several of the film's most enduring lines and gags, the luggage joke, the moving hump, the reaction to the stuck door, exist in the finished film specifically because someone on set broke from the page and Brooks chose not to fight it. That approach paid off in a way few comedies of that era managed. Young Frankenstein was made on a budget of roughly $2.8 million, modest even by the standards of its own time, and went on to earn more than $86 million at the worldwide box office. It became one of the highest-grossing American films released in 1974, competing directly with Brooks's own Blazing Saddles, which came out the same year. For a black-and-white horror parody shot with decades-old lab equipment, that kind of commercial success sent a clear message to the rest of the industry. Audiences could feel the difference between comedy that was tightly engineered and comedy that had room to breathe. What makes the film hold up so well today isn't just the writing, though the script Brooks and Wilder built together is genuinely sharp. It's that you can sense, even decades later, that the people on screen were having a real experience together, not simply performing lines each other. The laughter feels unforced because a lot of it was. The reactions feel spontaneous because many of them were the actors' first, unguarded response to something unexpected happening a few feet away from them. When Wilder breaks character for half a second, when Feldman's timing shifts slightly between takes, when a prop misbehaves and someone plays it off instead of stopping, all of that texture survived the editing process because Brooks valued it more than a flawless take. And that's really what that one photograph represents. It isn't a posed publicity still meant to advertise how funny the movie is. It's a documentary snapshot of a set where the line between rehearsed performance and genuine reaction had almost completely dissolved. Gene Wilder wasn't acting delighted for camera in that frame. He was actually delighted, caught at the exact instant his composure gave out, on a production where composure was never really the point. Half a century later, the film that photograph came from is still remembered as one of the sharpest horror comedies ever made, and the picture itself has quietly become a small piece of that legacy, proof that some of the best moments in film history were never written down at all. There are still plenty of stories from this shoot that never made it past the editing room, moments of improvisation and outright chaos that only the cast and crew ever witnessed firsthand. If you've come across any other behind-the-scenes stories from Young Frankenstein, or if you have a favorite line or gag from the film, drop it in the comments. It's a movie that keeps giving up new details the more you look into it.